Hello there, and welcome to Strangers No Longer. I am your host, Bill O'Brien. 3 years ago, we created Strangers No Longer, inspired by the pastoral letter of the same name written jointly by U.S. and Mexican bishops, the Bishops' Conference of both countries, calling for an overhaul of U.S. immigration laws. Our program will give an overview of the crisis in immigration and our faith traditions. Our presenters will each have a few minutes to cover their areas of expertise, beginning with Catholic social teaching and ending with what we can do as a community in our parishes. This program is being taped and will be available on YouTube for you to pass along to friends and family. Our presenters and many immigrants themselves really want to meet with your circle and your parish for deeper dives over the summer, and you can make arrangements simply by contacting Strangers No Longer. Now, on a prayerful note as we begin, a recent Sunday scripture reading described Moses being invited by Adonai, by Yahweh God, to the top of the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments. Moses knew that every time he went up to the top of the mountain to meet with God, there was a lot happening. Lightning, thunder, thick dark clouds, tremors in the mountains, trumpet blasts, even the silence was deafening. Now today, like on the top of the mountain, there's a lot going on. The pandemic, national protests against police violence, and a new and exciting struggle against racism in all its destructive forms. A worldwide migration crisis, a massive immigration crisis in this country, an election season looming. There's lots of trumpet blasts. And like Moses, I believe we are being invited by Yahweh God up to the top of the mountain. On the mountain, God was revealed to Moses as a God of faithful love of the people. And what did Moses do? Moses at once knelt on the ground, bowed, and said, "If I find favor with you, Lord, please, Lord, come along in our company on our journey. This indeed is a stiff-necked people, yet pardon our wickedness and sins and claim us as your own." So with a lot going on in our lives, may we begin with Moses's confident prayer to God. Please come along in our company. Please claim us as your own. Strangers No Longer and our new board of directors and the leaders of Circles of Support all hope that this introduction and overview will give you and your community strength for the journey ahead. So we're going to begin this session with an overview of Catholic social teaching, and we're very excited to have with us Father Dave Bursmeyer. Father Dave, here in the diocese, has had a number of parish assignments before that, though he received his licentiate in sacred theology in the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium. Since returning here to the diocese, I first got to know Father Dave when he was pastoring down in southern Wayne County, downriver at Christ the Good Shepherd, and then moved way up to the top of Macomb County at Saints John and Paul in Washington Township, and now pastors at St. Regis Parish in Bloomfield Hills. And on a personal note, he's my mom's pastor. So Father Dave, thanks for being with us. And if you could help us take a look at our own Catholic social teachings and how we can understand the core message of Jesus.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you for asking me to do this. The Catholic Church's response to certain questions is very consistent and firm. That fundamental question that confronts each of us: am I responsible to and for myself alone, or am I formed within and responsible to all the communities that I'm connected to? Again and again, the Catholic Church's response: we are formed within community and responsible for the dignity of each and every human being, but also for the social well-being of our communities and for helping our communities develop structures and policies that are just. Now, at one level, even apart from any particular faith perspective, we know that. We know that as we're born into this world, we come into environments which we have no say over, and yet they deeply shape our lives and our opportunities to use our gifts and talents. It matters if those environments are peaceful or violent, have abundance of food and water resources or scarcity, show care and respect for the created world, encourage and support the education of children or not, have social structures and cultural assets that are available to all, only to a wealthy few, have political systems that allow for true participation and change, have histories of favoritism or discrimination towards certain castes or classes or races. So even apart from faith, looking at the way the world works, we are formed by, shaped or misshaped by all of these social and economic realities. These factors are complex, but none are fixed in place. All can be moved in directions that fundamentally protect the dignity of every human person and the common good of the whole community. However, as people of faith, we also turn to our faith tradition and especially to our scriptures for foundational insights into who we are and how God wants us to live. Take the story of salvation that is told in our scriptures. What keeps us from that communion with God and others? Sin. Human choices that disrupt and break apart relationships with one another. She gave the fruit to me to eat. The serpent said to do it. I don't know where my brother is. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the serpent. Cain blames Abel. What is God's response to sin? To punish? Not really. Though some of the scripture moves in that direction, the fundamental and consistent response of God is to create deeper and deeper covenants with humanity. Again and again, God calls the people to task, to repentance, to recognize that we have to form right relationships. And the test of that is how we care for the marginal, represented in scripture most often by those who are poor or by those who are without resources. That triad of the widow, the orphan, the stranger or immigrant who lives amongst us. How we care for them is continually lifted up as a test of how well the community is living their covenant with God. Or think about Jesus and the gathering of disciples into a community. The very word church comes from kyriakos, belonging to the household of the Lord. The New Testament word, ecclesia, the assembly of God's people, from the Hebrew idea that God forms a holy people together. In other words, Christian faith is rooted in God's community. It is a terribly misdirected myth that faith is simply a matter of me and God, or as long as I'm saved, everything else is fine. Our faith is always directed to an ultimate communal shalom, a piece of God's kingdom and reign where the least among us is cared for. To help people of faith dialogue with the world about ethical and moral issues that are rooted in very complex social realities, the Catholic Church has developed over the last 130 years a set of principles that can be applied to complex social, economic, cultural, and political realities. They can help us judge the moral rightness or wrongness of certain structures and policies, and they offer a direction for evaluating all that we do. These principles are rooted in the stories of faith of our scriptures and are core to our ongoing faith tradition, but they're also offered as principles that all people of goodwill can embrace, whether one has faith or not. They have come to be called, as that slide says, our Catholic social teaching, or sometimes our Catholic social doctrine. So the next slide, please. There are two key principles at work. The first is the fundamental principle of human dignity, that every human being is endowed with a dignity that is intrinsic, inviolable, and inalienable. It's intrinsic. We are made in the image and likeness of God. From the very first moment of life to its natural end, each of us, no matter our age or ethnicity, our wealth or poverty, our language or creed, is endowed with a fundamental dignity. No one, other than God, confers that dignity on us. No one earns that dignity. No one has the power to decide who has it or not. It is part and parcel of being human. Inviolable. And so that intrinsic dignity must be respected and protected. Any actions, laws, or community standards that suggest some people do not have to be treated with dignity are immoral and unjust. There is no end or purpose, no matter how well intended, which can justify violating another person's human dignity. And it's inalienable. Nothing that we do, not even the worst actions or crimes, causes a human being to lose that dignity. Tying this principle to the reality of immigration calls us to evaluate our actions and our policies of detention, access to the justice system, proper education, healthcare, food, water, living conditions for people who are detained. Budget issues, fear, protection of the border, or any other reason can never, according to this principle of Catholic social teaching, be used to violate the fundamental dignity of each and every person who is seeking immigration. Now, the next slide, please. A second key principle is that of the common good, which is defined as the sum total of conditions are such that every person finds that they can meet their basic human needs. And then I list the various areas of life, all those areas. Now notice that the common good is not the greatest good for the greatest number, or the will of the majority, or the good of the vast majority. That would allow us to ignore the basic needs of those who, for whatever reason, have found themselves unable to take care of those needs. This principle insists that those of us who have more than enough for our basic needs have a responsibility, a moral obligation to use that surplus, especially for those whose basic human needs are not yet being met. The principle does not tell us how to share our surplus. It can be done via charity or taxation, or even stronger measures if necessary. But it does highlight that if there are people who do not have access to the goods necessary to live a dignified human life, we need to find a way to give them access to those goods. And until those basic needs are met, they have a moral claim on our surplus goods. Secondly, the common good is the sum total of social conditions which allow for each and every human being in the community to live their human dignity. So we're not just talking about enough money, but all the basic goods needed. What are the minimally necessary levels of access to food, water, clean air, health, education, the political process, cultural events, jobs, peace, and protection from harm? And thirdly, there's no way to move toward or achieve the common good in any area without building structures of justice and support. Individual goodwill is not enough. All of these complex areas form over time and produce institutions and structures that then take on a life of their own. If those structures are not serving the common good, then those structures need to change. That is precisely what is at the heart of the recent protests against violence, and is at the heart of the immigration crisis. The next slide, please. Catholic social teaching challenges us to protect the fundamental dignity of each and every immigrant, whether they have proper documents in hand or not. And that teaching asks us to evaluate policies and structures so that immigrants have access to sufficient food, water, clothing, education, the justice system, and so forth, sufficient to support their basic human needs. Looking at the reality of immigration and the people caught up in the current incoherent and at times unjust policies and laws, this principle of the common good urges us to do better. Access to at least the minimally necessary conditions and goods of life to live a dignified human life. Now, that is not an exceedingly high bar, nor is it unreachable, especially in our country. There are further principles of Catholic social teaching that have been developed to fill out this picture of what it means to protect human dignity and to support the common good. That's for a longer presentation. Let me conclude for now. Why be involved in immigration issues if you are a person of faith? Because how we treat those with little or no access to basic goods to fulfill their human dignity continues to be a test of how well we are living out our covenant with God. Why accompany immigrants and advocate for them? Because what we do to the ones most in need, we do to Jesus. Because those of us who have sufficient goods and a comfortable life have no right to those goods and comfort if the basic needs of others, in this case immigrants, are not being met. Because structures of injustice, though not created directly by any one of us, do support our ways of life. And these structures can change only if we recognize our moral responsibility to change them. A moral responsibility rooted deeply within our faith tradition. Thank you.
Father Dave, thanks very much. That was great. We know it's an overview. We know there's a lot of depth, and we'll be back. But thank you very much. I'm joined now by Kay Sofaro. Kay is the circle leader, one of the circle leaders at Christ Our Light Catholic Parish in Troy. And Kay and others, we have heard stories. We have heard immigrants tell their stories, their family stories, about why they left behind their home, their family, their work, and came on, some of them over 2,000 miles of a journey up to the United States. So Kay has been very kind to actually combine these stories and really help us understand, why did they leave? Why do they flee? Kay Sofaro from Christ Our Light. Thanks, Kay.
Thank you, Bill. My question is, why are they leaving their homes? Why do they leave? Well, today, many Central Americans are desperate to come to the United States. So the question is, why didn't so many want to come now? Let's take a look at that. So why do they want to come? Their country is so beautiful. What would make them leave this lovely setting? Let's take a look at the situation they're in. These are the reasons for immigration today. They're coming from Central America with many of the same reasons, actually, as earlier immigrants, but their situation is quite real and quite desperate. You probably know that there are gangs and violence in Central America. Gangs have actually changed a lot of the major cities in Central America into places too dangerous for families to even live. Families, especially women and children, are frequently the victims of rape, torture, kidnapping, or murder. In addition, you may not know that a dry corridor has brought more than 6 years of drought to Central America. This dry corridor is a huge area that stretches from southern Mexico down to Panama. It includes southern Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and parts of Nicaragua. This drought has caused severe food shortages. Families in this entire region have always, or farmers in this entire region, have always grown corn. Corn means life for the people here. But corn depends on rain, and the rain has been scarce for more than 6 years. Severe drought has created an incredible famine, as a matter of fact. The World Food Program tells us that between the years of 2010 to just 2015, there was a 500% increase of people leaving El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Another word for this is climate-driven migration. So why leave? These are the reasons they leave. The mafia-like gangs, violence and murders, years of drought, famine and hunger, poverty, desperation, and forced migration. They come to us with a desperate hope. They hope that they will be met with an organized immigration system ready to receive them and consider their plight. They hope to be received with respect and empathy, and they hope for an opportunity for a life where they might find a job, a home, and a life without violence. But what do they bump into? What do they encounter at that border? Instead, they find severely restrictive immigration and refugee laws, separation of families, even infants, dangerous overcrowding in holding areas, poor sanitation conditions, and very poor medical care, no consideration for their refugee crisis and the dangers they're encountering, and a lack of respect for their basic human dignity. As you will see, this is only a part of the whole story. The entire story has happened over a period of years and is very complex. We'll be touching on these issues as we move through our program. Thank you.
To our next section here, the whole history of immigration in the United States. Our presenter is Melanie Goldberg. Melanie, we got to know Melanie a couple of years ago, but when she began to do presentations at some of our parish circles and for some of our parishes after Mass, for instance. Melanie has 20 plus years of doing immigration legal work here in our region, but we're lucky to have her because she did her studies out in New York. So it's great that she's here. Melanie, every time that Melanie does a presentation for one of our circles or for one of our parishes, people call us afterwards and say, gee, I wish I had invited my friends, my family. I wish more people in our parish could have heard her. So we're lucky to have her with us. Melanie, please help us understand the whole history of U.S. immigration.
All in 10 minutes? I don't know about that. Thank you, Bill. To begin, I would like to add a caveat that these slides present an extremely simplified version of an extremely complex set of laws, policies, and procedures. At the request of the organizers of this event, I was asked to use these slides. I would be happy to share my presentation with my PowerPoint with you at your request anytime. Next slide, please. So there are two groups of people in general that come to the United States. We have non-immigrants. Those are people who are coming for a temporary period of time for a specific purpose. Those would be visitors for work or pleasure, students, temporary workers, both agricultural and high-skilled, performers, athletes, and many more. Then we have immigrants. Immigrants are coming here with the intent to stay in the United States for the foreseeable future, or perhaps permanently. And most of them have the goal of becoming a U.S. citizen. These immigrants can be sponsored by employers or certain family members. That would be spouses, children, and siblings, and parents. Siblings of U.S. citizens are the ones who may wait for 20 years, unless, of course, they are siblings of U.S. citizens and are from Mexico or the Philippines, in which case their wait will be approximately 30 years. This is all calculated by a formula set out in the Immigration and Nationality Act. Next slide, please. So here are the legal paths to becoming an immigrant. First, we have, like we spoke about just now, family-based permanent resident card. Family-based. They can get a permanent resident card, which is the green card. They must be a relative of the nuclear family member. A marriage to a U.S. citizen can provide immediate access to a green card. Immediate meaning as long as the processing time takes, which can be up to a year. And who knows, could be even longer. Then there's also the employment-based, and there are varying wait times for those as well. We have asylum. You can apply for asylum if you are fearing persecution because of race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, and political opinion. Race, religion, nationality, and political opinion are pretty clear. Membership in a particular social group, that's a more changing category, and the definitions are getting narrower and narrower on those. A refugee, so an asylee is somebody who's in the United States. Maybe they came as a student, or they came for a visit, and some major coup or political upheaval happens in their country while they're here in the United States. For that reason, they can then apply for asylum and say, I have a fear of going back home because X, Y, or Z. A refugee is approved outside of the United States by the United Nations. They are determined to be a refugee. And for the same reasons, race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. There are long wait times for refugee. Approval time is not 2 to 2.5 months. It's actually closer to 1.5 years to 2 years. Our refugees admitted to the United States has steadily decreased. The caps that have been allowed. So in 2016, we had 85,000 who were allowed. Prior to that, it was more like 100,000. And now our 2020 fiscal year cap is set at 18,000. And with our current restrictions of travel and consulates being closed and no international travel, that number is sure to be even less than 18,000 by September 30th, which is the end of the 2020 fiscal year. We also have to note that the number of migrants and refugees around the world is increasing. I believe the current number is 6.5 million refugees in the world, and the richest country, or one of the richest countries, is now taking only 18,000. Then we have the visa lottery, which is truly a lottery. This is an application that people can apply for online. They don't need to have an employer or a family sponsor. They just need to fill out the application, have to have, I believe, a high school diploma and some work experience. They can apply for themselves. There are 50,000 of these every year. 100,000 people receive the letter that say that they've been chosen. And if they're coming with a wife and children, that eats up even more of the 50,000. So actually the 50,000 that are admitted are not necessarily 50,000 people, but members of the family attached to that person. So next slide. Here we have again on the left the different ways that somebody may come to the United States. There are ways to immigrate, and on the right we have ways that show reasons why people should not be or will not be granted asylum or refugee status. So the current Attorney General under the current administration has wiped away precedents which allowed for victims of gang violence and victims of domestic violence to be granted asylum. Fleeing drought, climate change, economic reasons, and just wanting a better life for the family have never been reasons to be granted asylum. Next slide. And here we'll have a brief history of immigration. And next slide. We're not, sometimes we call ourselves a melting pot. There's a lot of educational and theoretical discussion about whether we are a melting pot and maybe a salad bowl. But we've been struggling with this through the centuries to achieve an equitable immigration policy. Next slide. And here are some of the things that happen. And there's always waves of immigration, waves of increased immigration, waves of decreased immigration. Certain things around the world happen. Certain things domestically happen. It has to do a lot with what our domestic economic situation is, and also what kind of international political events are happening. So for instance, every wave has their push and pull factor. Irish immigration wave because of the famine in Ireland. And then all of a sudden you have so many Irish coming to the United States that it creates anti-immigrant sentiment, and you see signs in history books showing no Irish need apply. And then we have Chinese workers. We needed workers on the West Coast. China was the closest place. The West Coast, San Francisco area is closest place for Chinese to land in the boats. They're the ships, and they come, they work in the gold mines and build railroads and work in agriculture, and people seeing the Chinese communities prospering because of that, so they become the scapegoats, and we have the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so it goes through history. You know, we had World War II. We had a lot of US young men going to fight the war, so we needed workers so that we have the Mexicans where we're welcoming them to come in and work, but then they become, you know, there's too many, or the men come back from war, we no longer need them, so they're deported. Next slide. And so as we see, this is, you know, 9/11 was just another in a series of events that happened that brings xenophobia in the US to the fore. It's just another excuse for being afraid of others and for limiting immigration. And so goes the waves of increase and decrease. And right now, we are in probably the most xenophobic period of immigration in history. And so that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Melanie Goldberg. It's always nice to see you. Thank you. Our next presenter is Professor Gail Presby, who's in the philosophy department at the University of Detroit Mercy. Gail received her doctorate at Fordham University, but also did further studies in Kenya and in India. Gail, thanks for being with us.
Hello, everybody. So glad to meet you here online to talk about history of U.S. policy with Central America, Mexico, places where migrants are coming from. Let's take this long historical sweep next. So ancient Mesoamerica, this includes parts of Mexico and Central America today, and they have a long history with amazing accomplishments, one of them being domestication of corn from a wild grass. And that happened around 7000 BCE. Next. The Mayan civilization is just one of the examples of one of these great civilizations. We have found their writing, which they did in glyphs, some of the oldest being 300 BCE. They built pyramids, they had big cities and beautiful artwork, and they had a great understanding of the stars and astronomy. Next. So they had this great history, but really there are many recent arrivals, and we are some of them. But when Cortez comes in 1517 and conquers Mexico, he brings Catholicism, and there's pros and cons to all these changes that come to the Americas because of that. The Catholic Church, some of whom preserved the Mayan text, others of whom destroyed the Mayan text, and sometimes it's the same person, Diego de Landa, first destroyed and felt guilty and then preserved some of them. That's how we know the history. But all of what we now consider Southwest US had been part of northern Mexico and had that Spanish and Catholic heritage for a long time before it became part of the US. If we turn our attention now to Southeast, what we know as Southeast US, it was also first colonized and settled by the Spanish. Of course, Native Americans were already living there, but the Franciscan friars came, settled in the middle of Native American communities, established their missions there, up to about 400 missions in the area of Florida, Georgia, etc. And so this whole southern half of the US was Spanish-speaking Catholic influence before the English-speaking settlers started coming from the north. Now, the new settlers had this philosophy of manifest destiny. It's an ideology that says God meant us to take over this continent from ocean to ocean. And a lot of the motivation in the South was they wanted to add southern states would be slave states and grow cotton. The North was trying to get their states to be free states. And in this way, he took over the continent, becoming the United States as we know today. Next. Here's a map that shows, and you might have learned this in your history classes, but did you realize, for example, Louisiana Purchase, the people living there were ethnic French, Spanish, and Mexican descent, speaking French and Spanish. It's the English speakers who came, and sometimes even using filibusters and using violence. They took these territories, either purchased in the Louisiana case or in Texas, had their filibuster uprising, had the Mexican-American War, and annexed all this area, making Texas a slave state. Next. After Manifest Destiny stretched the U.S. from ocean to ocean, there was still this restlessness. The U.S. has to expand. its influence. And here's a example. Teddy Roosevelt, who wanted the Panama Canal and wanted a U.S. zone all the way along the Panama Canal, intervened in Colombian politics because Panama had only been a peninsula of Colombia. Roosevelt and the U.S. aided the separatists so that they could declare independence and have those separatists in the new Panama immediately sign a contract for the Panama Canal and the Canal Zone. And this is just one example. The U.S. and Spanish-American War took over Puerto Rico, which we still hold today. We don't count people in the Canal Zone or when we had it, or in Puerto Rico, we don't give them the same rights. There's this emphasis that English is better, Spanish is not as good. You know, white is better than mixed race, etc. So over the century of the 1900s, U.S. intervened often in the politics of Latin American countries, sometimes covertly, indirectly, sometimes directly, bringing in the troops. And oftentimes, the U.S. supported a dictator if that dictator would be friendly to U.S. economic or political interests, oftentimes at the expense of the poor, at the expense of political dissidents, and at the expense of human rights of people in their own countries. Next. And this map will show you several of these examples, but moving ahead to the 1980s, you might know the example Rios Montt, who was got U.S. Military backing. He had a war against the Mayan people of his own country. 100,000 were killed. And recently in Guatemala, he stood trial and was found guilty for that genocide. Next. In this turbulent time, Oscar Romero was the Archbishop of El Salvador when there was this civil war in El Salvador. People who wanted land, who had been marginalized, were fighting for their rights. Romero wanted peace, and Romero was worried U.S. sending all these military arms and funds to El Salvador was leading to more deaths. He spoke out against the war, and he was killed by an assassin while he was saying mass. He was such a well-loved person. He's made a saint now, Saint Oscar Romero. Next. Do you know that the U.S. was actually found guilty of war crimes by the World Court in The Hague back in 1986? The U.S., while Reagan was president, was helping arm and organize the Contras in Honduras who were attacking Nicaragua. And they also mined Nicaragua's harbors. And the World Court says this is a violation of the Treaty of Friendship 1956. So the U.S. was found at fault. The U.S. did many underhanded things. You might have known at that time period as the Iran-Contra affair, where Reagan got funds from selling arms to Iran so that Contras could be armed because Congress had cut off funds for that because of the human rights violations there. In 1989, back in El Salvador, 6 Jesuits who were living and working at the University of Central America, the Jesuit University in San Salvador, were killed by assassins along with their housekeeper and her daughter. And they had been highlighting and recording human rights violations in El Salvador, and they had been negotiating for peace there when they were killed. Next. So why do people migrate to the U.S.? Since 1989, some of the economic policies of the U.S. have really impacted the area. There was NAFTA and CAFTA for Mexico and Central America. Through these, there were many impacts of these economic treaties, but one of them is the U.S. flooded this area with cheap agricultural exports, which put a lot of farmers in Mexico and Central America out of business. Couldn't compete with subsidized agricultural exports. And also mining companies from US and Canada could not be held accountable for environmental violations. There were both push factors and pull factors that impacted people and their decision to migrate at this time. This is part of the historical background of the desperation of people coming to the US, which, as we have seen, used to be part of Spanish-speaking Mexico, now part of our country, and yet we close the borders even though we are part of the push and pull factors that are background for why they want to come here in the first place. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction. Thank you.
Gail Presby, thanks very much for helping us out. Our next presenter is Yanira Arias, and Yanira joins us from Puerto Rico. Yanira is the campaign manager for the transnational network called Alianza Americas, which is a partner with Strangers No Longer. Yanira grew up in El Salvador, got her degree there, and then became part of a community here in the United States called TPS, Temporary Protected Status. She'll describe that. Most impressive about Yanira is the number of organizations and networks that she's been a part of. She actually describes herself as a member of many communities and learning from each community. And I'm challenged because she really makes an effort to get to know people in different communities. Joining us from Puerto Rico, Yanira Arias.
Thank you very much, Bill. An honor to join you and to join your community, Strangers No Longer. And next slide, please. Most immigrants, 77%, are in the country legally. In 2017, 45% were naturalized US citizens. Some 27% of immigrants were permanent residents and 5% were temporary residents in 2017. In a few slides, I will be sharing a little bit more about two particular populations who are temporary immigrants. 23% of all immigrants were unauthorized immigrants. From 1990s to 2007, the unauthorized immigrant population increased from 3.5 million to 12.2 million. But by 2017, that number had declined. Currently, there are 10.5 million unauthorized immigrants in the US. The decline has to have with, due largely to the fall of number from people from Mexico migrating, and also a combination of anti-immigrant policies, particularly during the presidency of President Obama. Over 2.5 million undocumented immigrants were deported. Next slide, please. Often referred as to the green card lottery, the visa benefit immigrants, people from countries with low immigration rates to the US. The lottery started in the 1990s as a way to benefit a growing population of undocumented Irish immigrants before it evolved to include countries that don't send too many immigrants to the US. The number of diversity visas is limited by law to 55,000 per fiscal year, but the annual cap has been reduced to 50,000 since the fiscal year 2000. Immigration restrictions think it's time to reduce the overall opportunity to immigrate to the United States. First, limit the number of foreign nationals who are able to get green cards to reunite with their families already in the US. Currently, the largest category of legal immigrants. Second, to cut the number of refugees in half. Third, eliminate the diversity visa lottery. Next slide, please. Congress created temporary protected status. As Bill said, I am a TPS holder. TPS, it's a law. It's part of the Immigration Act of the 1990s. And it's a status that provides to nationals of specifically designated countries that are confronting an ongoing armed conflict environmental disasters, or extraordinary and temporary conditions that prevent the people from returning safely to the countries of origin. It provides a work permit, social security number, and a state of deportation. The Secretary of Homeland Security is the person who decides when a country merits the TPS designation. That designation can go from 6 months, 12 months, or 18 months. The law doesn't define in terms temporary or otherwise limit the number of times for which a country can have a TPS designation. It is very important to say that the history of TPS has to give a lot of credit to the organizing efforts of faith-based communities. More than 3,000 people from El Salvador were forced to migrate due to the civil war in the 80s. The faith-based led prayers, vigils, hunger strikes, march, calls to Congress. Everything helped until Congress enacted the TPS law. And currently, TPS holders are part of the economy, including those industries identified as essential industries during the COVID-19. Next slide, please. As the Trump administration works to systematically dismantle the US immigration system, over the past 3 years, it has ended the designation of 6 of the 10 countries that you see on the screen. 2 lawsuits, Bataray and Nielsen, protecting Honduras and Nepal, who receive a cancellation notice, and the Ramos versus Nielsen, which is the second lawsuit, is protecting also El Salvador, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Sudan. Both lawsuits are preventing Trump from deporting close to 300,000 people. This means that the people who has TPS, like myself, from these countries, we can continue to have protections from deportation, and our work authorization is still valid. On average, TPS holders have lived over 20 years in the United States, and many TPS holders have families in the United States. Some 279,000 are US citizen children of TPS parents. Next slide, please. The Fair Action of Childhood Arrivals is the second program of immigrants with temporary status, as I mentioned at the beginning. DACA is a kind of an administrative relief to protect eligible immigrant youth who came to the United States when they were children. DACA gives youth undocumented immigrants protection from deportation and work permit. The program expires after 2 years, subject to renewal. DACA is a direct victory of undocumented youth, asking President Obama to use his executive power to protect them. For several years, they led sit-ins, hunger strikes, marches, and social media campaigns. It was on June 15 that President Obama, in June 15, 2012, when President Obama announced that he will finally use his executive power to protect some of the young undocumented. But on the campaign trail, when Donald Trump started to campaigning, he said that he wanted to undo DACA. Now, as a president, he took action to terminate, and right after he took the decision to end DACA, several lawsuits across the country, including California, New York, Maryland, Washington, D.C., challenged the legality of the process of ending DACA. Next slide, please. There are several requirements to qualify for DACA, but because of the time, I will go over on a few of the requirements. The person has to be under 31 years old as of June 15, 2012. The person has to arrive to the United States before the age of 16. Have lived continuously in the United States from June 15 to the present time. Physically present in the United States on June 15. The person is currently studying or graduated from high school or earned a certificate of completion of high school or GED. Have not been convicted of a felony, including a single DUI or 3 or more misdemeanor of any kind. Just in Michigan, there are more than 50,000 DACA recipients. 3,000 young residents in Michigan satisfy all of the requirements for DACA, but the educational requirements. And this is because they cannot go to school because they are part of the family bringing bread to the table. So it doesn't mean that they don't want to go to school. They are very busy working to help their parents to meet all the bills in the household. And that's the reason why those 3,000 didn't qualify for DACA in Michigan. Next slide, please. Fully 36% of workers in farming, fishing, and forestry fields are immigrants without a college degree. As a 36% of building and grounds, cleaning and maintenance workers, 27% of hotel workers, and 21% of home healthcare industry workers. Immigrants help fill the key gaps in the US economy. The high employment levels of immigrants indicate that employers' demand for their labor remains high. Among the important reasons cited for the high demand have been the substantial shrinkage since 1990 of the US-born, younger, less skilled, working age population, higher educational attainment among US-born, and a fertility rate below the replacement rate for the US-born. In other words, immigrants appear to be taking low-skilled jobs that natives either are not available or are unwilling to take. Next slide, please. Several reports provide data that helps dispute the erroneous ideas that the undocumented immigrants are a drain to taxpayers. In fact, like all other living and working in the United States, undocumented immigrants are taxpayers and collectively contribute an estimated $11.74 billion to state and local coffers each year via combined sales, personal income, and property taxes. On average, the nation estimated close to 11 million undocumented immigrants pay 8% of their income in state, local taxes every year. What is unlikely to happen in the current political environment, undocumented immigrants, state and local contributions could increase by up to 2.1 billion under a humane and just immigration reform. Next slide, please. Good policy is informed policy. Just like the horrendous impact of breaking up families should not be ignored. Research has long shown that recent immigrants are no more prone to criminality than native-born Americans. In fact, studies have suggested they are less so. A study published in the academic journal Criminology in 2018 found that undocumented immigrants does not increase violence. Similarly, the Libertarian Cato Institute found that immigrants in Texas, both undocumented and undocumented, were less likely than native-born Americans to be arrested or convicted for homicide, sex crimes, or larceny. Xenophobic and anti-immigrant voices are deploying this dehumanizing language to justify inhumane policies such as caging children, shredding the asylum system, shattering families across America, incarcerating tens of thousands law-abiding people, ending TPS and DACA, banning Muslims from entering the US, and more. We all can take action by resisting this narrative and contributing to build one of that humanizes immigrants and vulnerable populations. I commend the work of Strangers No Longer because this is one of the steps that will take us to build a new narrative. Thank you very much, and thank you for your participation in this conversation.
Yanira, thanks very much, and thanks for being available for deeper dives, as are other immigrant families in our area that would love to speak by Zoom or in person with your circle, with your parish. Set it up, give us a call. Our next presenter is Bridget Theodora, pastoral chaplain at Beaumont Hospital, and has been during this time of COVID. So Bridget, I know you've been through a lot the last couple of months, but we got to know Bridget when she was the pastoral minister at Saints John and Paul Parish at the top of Macomb, Washington Township. Bridget, please help us. What do we do? Not by ourselves, but what do we do as a community to respond?
Thank you, Bill. So for starters, you can join a parish circle of support or start one at your parish. Next slide, please. So the education piece, we have to educate ourselves. We can listen to those stories of immigrants, refugees, and undocumented. And if you also want to start on your own, you can go to StoryCorps.com. They have a bunch of stories on file that you can hear by searching either immigrants or refugees, and those stories will pop up for you. You can study the topic. That's what we did at Saints John and Paul. We read Strangers No Longer, which is the church document, and it's located on the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops website. They have a lot of good resources there. In the Strangers No Longer document, you can see the topic of migration through the Old Testament, New Testament, and Catholic social teaching. And then once you've educated yourself, you can educate the parish. You can invite an immigration lawyer to speak. That's what we did. And we had lots of time for questions and answers to learn about the immigration process. You can write bulletin articles for your parish and see if you can get those published so that everybody can understand what you've educated yourself with. And then also you can talk to your faith formation director and ask how the topic is being taught throughout the parish. Maybe you can have an adult faith formation night where you can touch on some of these topics, Catholic social teaching and the topic of immigration. Next slide, please. The accompaniment piece, we did a little bit of searching in our own community to see what was needed. We drove and supported some of our friends we met through this parish circle support with immigration issues. We drove them to court and supported them in court. Luckily, we had a lawyer or a judge in the parish, and so that judge helped with paperwork and so on. Sister Valerie, who is our Hispanic minister in the North Macomb Vicariate, she took some of us to a family who had just learned that their father, their husband, was being deported. And so we just sat with the family that night, cried with them, and listened to their story. And of course, sharing a meal together always lets everybody know that they're not alone on the journey, that when we break bread together, we form a new family. Next slide, please. The advocacy piece, you can see here, there are a lot of things you can do. We, first of all, pray. That's a great being an advocate for each other. You can write letters and emails, make calls to legislators. Our parish circle support met with the Macomb County Sheriff as well as the Shelby Township Sheriff. And so we brought along some of those stories that we heard in the community about people being pulled over for something minor and then jailed or detained for months. In one instance, we met with the Shelby Township Sheriff, and he had no idea that this mom in his community, a mother of 3, had been detained for 2 months for a speeding ticket because of some other issues. And so we talked to both the Shelby Township Sheriff and the Macomb County Sheriff and had to ask for them. We asked them not to participate in ICE detainers, which is like if you're pulled over for just a simple thing like a speeding ticket or a broken taillight, that they can't ask you for documentation. Macomb County is a welcoming community, and so we asked them to go along with that welcoming community and not ask for the paperwork and not detain some of these people for a really long time, kept them away from their family and their work. And so through all this education, the education went the other way too. We educated the sheriffs. They had no idea that it was so tough for some of our immigrant brothers and sisters to renew their driver's license. We had a woman who worked at an immigration lawyer's office with us in those meetings, and she explained to them the process and how it had changed recently. And so the sheriffs had some new understanding too. And so we exchanged information, made an ask. It was a little daunting at first, but we did it. And so we all came to a new understanding and a new place of trust and relationship. relationship. And also, you can join with other parishes near you and other groups advocating for the same issues. Maybe you don't have enough people in your own parish to start one, but maybe the neighboring parish does, and you join with them. Or maybe you can find a couple people here, a couple people there, and all join together. Now that we're looking at a different model of parish relationship with the new idea of families of parishes, maybe we can share some of those resources too. Next slide, please. I leave you with these two quotes. The first one is from Pope Francis on a day of prayer for political leaders, just encouraging us to get involved in the political process and change structures for the common good. And then the other quote is from the Gospel of John, where Jesus sends an advocate to be with us, the Holy Spirit. And so we know that we never do this work alone, that Jesus is with us through the power of the Holy Spirit. So that can be an emboldening prospect for us, just like those first apostles were emboldened by the Holy Spirit to go out and spread the gospel. So I ask you again, after all these presentations, this last question, this reflection question that we began with, how is God calling me to help change social structures to protect and preserve human life and dignity? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. That's our overview, and we are very grateful to our presenters. And we're also grateful for the contributions of the University of Detroit Mercy and Alianza Americas. A few reminders: this program will be available on YouTube, and we will send you the link. But the presenters themselves have offered to be available to your circle of support, your parish, your friends. Please consider inviting them. Just contact us. Our email address is on the screen. Thank you for being with us in this presentation, but also for being with us as we build a community of strangers no longer. We hope to see you soon.